John Bolton just made his first court appearance, pleading not guilty to charges alleging that he mishandled classified information. Comes after he surrendered to authorities earlier this morning. Just yesterday, Bolton, now a prominent critic of President Trump, was indicted by a federal grand jury. He's charged with 8 counts of transmission of national defense information and 10 counts of unlawful retention of that information, 18 counts in all. Let's go right to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, this first appearance just wrapping up, but we know we have a not guilty plea. What else are we learning this week?
Yeah, and that would be as expected, Joe, as the former national security advisor has maintained all along that he never put any classified information in his book, the thing that's at issue here, and that he never really engaged in any wrongdoing at all. He and his attorneys have maintained that he got waivers from the national security advisors and was told that his book was good to go. Obviously, the government disputes that. He's in court right now, as we understand it. You just saw a video of him there walking in to make his first appearance today. Before that first appearance in court, Joe, he had to go through all the routine processing just like any other defendant, as we've seen so many times before. You have to go in, you have to submit all of your data, you have to take your fingerprints, you have to get a mugshot, all of those things, sort of surreal moment, if you will, to have someone who is at the highest levels of U.S. government going in now as a criminal defendant, just like anybody else, subjected to some of that routine processing. Typically at a hearing like this, in your first appearance, there'll be discussions around discovery. That's the information, the evidence that the government has amassed there, that the defense is certainly going to want to get their hands on as they sort of start to mount their case and understand just what the government has in store here. Remember, the grand jury process, the grand jury, the one that actually indicted him, entirely secret, Joe. The defense is not there. The defense attorneys are not there. They have no idea what went before that grand jury. But we have now gotten a lot more information than we had the day before, given this lengthy indictment. And we should mention, this indictment is chock full of information that we just didn't have a full appreciation before. All of the documents, all of the more than 1,000 pages prosecutors say they got their hands on, that Bolton was wrongfully, in their view, sharing with 2 family members, essentially using them as sort of quasi-editors before he eventually published a manuscript documenting his time in the White House, Joe. So we wait to see what other information comes out of court there. But again, the former national security John Bolton pleading not guilty right now, Joe. And
we'll wait to see if we find out a trial date out of this hearing as well. Laura, remind us how these charges seem to be more serious than the ones facing some other Trump adversaries who've recently been indicted, including former FBI Director James Comey and the current New York Attorney General Letitia James.
Yeah, so it's worth noting here, Joe, the case of James and Comey were run out of the Eastern District of Virginia by a political appointee, someone who formerly served as the president's defense counsel, who has no experience as a prosecutor. Her name is Lindsay Halligan. And if you look at the charging papers, it's signed just by Lindsay Halligan, presumably because no other career prosecutors in the office wanted to participate. In the case of John Bolton, it's a very different story. You see a litany of national security career people, career prosecutors in the office of Maryland, which has a lot of experience with these types of cases. And so that's one thing that distinguishes it. Also, just how much information is contained in this indictment. It's what's known as a speaking indictment, Joe. It tells a story, whereas the one for both Letitia James and for Comey, it's much more bare bones. It's hard to know exactly what prosecutors have there. They don't have to reveal everything in the indictment, but certainly they're telling a very detailed story when it comes to Bolton. Also worth noting here what Bolton has been charged with, both the retention of classified information, so he took stuff home that he wasn't supposed to have, and the dissemination, the transmission of classified information. Very serious charges. We've all become very well acquainted with classified document cases in recent years. You think back to President Biden, President Trump, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Obviously, Biden and Clinton not charged. Trump was, but we should know what Trump was charged with. One of the things is the same thing that Bolton was, the retention of classified information by someone who was allowed to have it, but wasn't supposed to have it in the way that they were. But the distinction here, Joe, is that Trump was not charged with transmitting that classified information in the way that Bolton is, Joe.
It's an issue that has surfaced many times over the past few years. We should note John Bolton pleading not guilty today, but he was proactively speaking out ahead of of this indictment, expecting it might be coming. What are some of the things we've heard him say about this?
Yeah, you remember this was an investigation that stretches back years. In the waning years of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, Joe, the Justice Department was interested in whether he had wrongfully divulged classified information in his book. It's called The Room Where It Happened. It's chock full of scathing information about Trump and things that he observed while in the White House. And the Justice Department wondered whether he had gotten his hands on classified information and used it in a wrong way, perhaps sharing draft manuscripts with people who weren't supposed to have it. That starts under the first Trump administration. Joe, that investigation actually continued into the Biden administration. So it crossed administrations, and the Biden administration closed it. Now, we're going to need to do some more understanding about why they closed it, but they closed it. Then all of a sudden you see the FBI raiding his home and his office just this last summer, and it was sort of our first tip to the idea, oh, this investigation is back, and it's now hot, given that they got a warrant from a judge. You have to get a judge to sign off on that. And so obviously the government had probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed. When they went into his home and office, you remember you see them carrying out boxes. They seized phones. They seized computers. Clearly, some of the material that they used to serve as the basis for this latest indictment, Joe.
All right, Laura, we're going to ask you to stand by in case we do learn some more information out of that courthouse. Let's bring in White House correspondent Monica Alba right now. Monica, President Trump was asked about this indictment yesterday, calling Bolton a bad guy. Over these past couple days, what have we heard from the White House and the Trump administration?
Yeah, it's really notable, Joe, this coming today and yesterday when the president was informed about this happening in real time. He said that he didn't know about it in that moment, but he did comment more generally on his former national security advisor, saying, quote, that he was a bad guy and that this is just, quote, the way it goes. Remember that this is somebody who served for the first Trump administration for about 17 months from 2018 to 2019 before President Trump decided to let him go. At the time, John Bolton had said that he had offered his resignation, so there was some dispute about how he left the first administration, but the president has made no secret of his feelings about him in the last couple of years, and certainly in the last couple of months he has talked about him. And remember that just weeks right after he took office here in this second term, he stripped John Bolton of his security detail and of his security clearance. So those were among some of the first moves that President Trump made this time around that were a clear indication of his feelings about him. And John Bolton, in his recent comments when he had been interviewed leading up to this indictment, said that he believed that Donald Trump was carrying out, quote, a retribution presidency. And this comes, of course, Joe, against the backdrop of, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen President Trump name people that he believes his Department of Justice should go after, should potentially launch criminal investigations against or into. We have seen that come to fruition in a couple of cases, but we know that there are other names that the president has even mentioned. And in a message that was meant to be private to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, he did talk about the fact that some people he wanted investigated had not happened as quickly as he liked and wanted to stress the urgency of the situation. Now, John Bolton was not mentioned among those names, but we know there have certainly been others, including former FBI Director James Comey, the New York Attorney General Letitia James, and California Senator Adam Schiff that he has talked about, and that we have seen some action, of course, when it comes to Comey and when it comes to James in particular, not yet to California Senator Adam Schiff. But just this week, the president did appear with his attorney general and with the FBI director in an event where he was naming other people and where he continues to stress that people that he believes did things that were illegal, that the president has said are illegal, he wants to see some kind of action from his Department of Justice. But John Bolton falls into the category of somebody who was once an ally and, of course, then became a very outspoken critic who was not shy at all about saying that he does believe this is specifically the president trying to get revenge on him for the role that he played over the last couple of years and what he has said since leaving the White House. Joe.
And Monica, you mentioned that the president put out this very sort of public note, whether it was accidental, as he says, basically urging 3 people to be charged. 2 of them have been charged in recent weeks. As you mentioned, Senator Schiff has not been charged with anything. Were we seeing this same type of public pressure campaign from President Trump when it specifically came to John Bolton?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting, because he hadn't been included in these specific categories. And when he has been really direct to mention people, he's talked about some others who served both in the Biden administration, and even he has talked about the potential for the DOJ to look at former FBI Director Christopher Wray, who is somebody who President Trump had worked with and had appointed years ago. So there are other people that he had talked about, but he hadn't specifically included John Bolton in the same way that we have seen the mention of some of these other perceived political opponents, certainly that the president does spend a fair amount of time talking about. But again, when we learned originally that those materials had been removed from John Bolton's home, the president was asked specifically if he had been given a heads up about that. He said he didn't know about that. But interestingly, Joe, at the time he said, if I wanted to get involved, I could. And if I wanted to be the one who was directing some of that, he says he could, but that in this instance, he was not.
And noteworthy, we did hear from both the Attorney General and the FBI Director about this indictment yesterday, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this has been a moment where we have seen both the Attorney General and FBI Director and others involved in this really try to talk about this in the context of no one is above the law, and that they will continue to pursue these kinds of investigations and bring potential criminal charges, they say, against anybody who, in their view, could jeopardize national security. And as you see there, specifically, Attorney General Pam Bondi said the law applies to everyone and justice never sleeps. And we know, Joe, that she is here very often. This is somebody who is speaking with the president constantly, who is here for many different events. Again, we just saw her a couple of days ago in that announcement with the president and the FBI director about their so-called crime crackdown across the nation. But they are in constant contact. And again, the president has been extremely clear with his directives about who he would like to see investigated and potentially criminally charged.
And because of that, we've certainly heard some critics, especially when it comes to Comey, when it comes to Letitia James, who've wondered if these are politically motivated. I mean, have Democrats been speaking out a lot about this?
Certainly. They have definitely raised these concerns, and they point to the fact that this shouldn't really come as a surprise to many people, because it is something that the president telegraphed that he might do if he won a second term. He used to talk all the time on the campaign trail about the idea that this term could be focused, could be centered on retribution, on revenge. And remember that the FBI director, Kash Patel, had a so-called enemies list with a bunch of different names appearing on it. The FBI director, for his part, has tried to distance himself from that, saying that that is not an accurate portrayal of that. But we know that there had been many different discussions that perhaps would take place behind the scenes, but that in this moment, in this administration, and the very little separation you see, the total eroding and erasure of a line between the White House and the Department of Justice, it's something that they have talked about and really put out publicly and in the open, and Democrats and critics have certainly raised that as something they've taken issue with.
All right, Monica, Alba, thank you so much. Let's get right back to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, we are getting some more information out of the courtroom, including conditions of release and some future court dates. What are we learning?
Yeah, remember, we can't have any cameras, unfortunately, in a federal courthouse, Joe, and so we're relying on our producers. They're in the room who, of course, as we reported, that Bolton has pled not guilty to all 18 counts there. They're also getting information about how much punishment he would be facing if convicted. We're obviously a long way away from trial, but obviously he's facing a very serious set of charges here, which include 10 years in custody, a $250,000 fine per count, so that's times 18, and 3 years of special release. Of course, punishment entirely up to the judge in this case, and we're obviously, again, a far ways away from trial as he's pled not guilty and denies any wrongdoing here. We should also mention that his lawyer, Abby Lowell, has taken custody of Bolton's passport, and there would be some travel restrictions on him. That's done, of course, to show that he's not a flight risk. They don't need to put any restraints on him. He's obviously going home today. He hasn't been taken into custody. He wasn't arrested. He voluntarily turned himself in. And so all of these sort of conditions of release that you see, fairly typical here, Joe. We should mention they'll be back in court next month. This is just the first appearance, the first of what is going to be a very long road. They're going to have a bunch of pretrial motions where they'll try, I would imagine, to get this case thrown out, as we have seen in other cases, the case of James Comey. As you remember, another foe of the president trying to similarly get his case tossed out. And so they'll all be back in court mid next month, Joe. And
I know the Comey case is set to go to trial fairly quickly. This one could take a little longer.
Classified documents, always a tricky issue. It involves a complicated set of procedures and issues. The judge may need to take his time on this one, Joe.
All right. Laura, Jarrett, good to have you with us. Thank you so much. And we'll have coverage ahead right here on NBC News Now and online.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.